a celebration in honor of the 40th anniversary of the publication of Time, Space, and Knowledge. And I think just about all of you know about that, something about that, and we'll learn more in the course of the afternoon. We are meeting here in Mangalam Center, which is, you could say, unofficially the home of the Center for Creative Inquiry, which was founded as an organization to help explore the many aspects of the time, space, knowledge, the TSK vision. But of course, the TSK has been studied and practiced throughout our community and also by other people who have come in contact with it. In fact, I'm always a little surprised. Every now and then we hear from somebody who's been studying it on their own for years, and we had no idea. So it's great that we have this opportunity to come together. It's really been something that's touched a lot of people's lives. So our plan for today is we're going to start with a totally spontaneous and unrehearsed interview. Arnaud Maitland's going to join me here, and I will be the interviewee, although there are people here who have more experience, a longer experience with TSK than I do. But I'll have to be the one. Then after that interview, we're going to have a couple of people come up. Hal Gurish, who was one of my first TSK teachers, is here, which is a wonderful honor. It's been a while since we've seen Hal. And Ken McKeon, who teaches TSK regularly at the Nyingma Institute and has been studying it for many years. And Ken's going to lead us in a little TSK exercise, the experiential side. And then after that, we're going to show some videos, very short videos, that are just people who have recorded some messages, people who've studied TSK over the years. So they're mostly just little iPhone videos. And then well, actually, maybe after the interview, at any point, people should feel free to speak up and ask questions or make comments. And then maybe we will invite some comments from people who are here. There are a lot of people here who really have been studying TSK for a long time. And it'd be great to hear from them. On the other hand, there are people here who don't know a whole lot about it, and it'd be great to hear from them too. So I encourage everybody to participate. And after that, we will adjourn. We should be finished before 6. And then downstairs we have some snacks, verging on a real meal. There will be spanakopita, so there'll be a warm dish in addition to various things to nibble on, and there'll be wine. So I hope everybody can stick around to join us for that. Okay, Arnaud, you want to come up? Maybe I should introduce Arnaud, for those of you who don't know him. He's the director of Dharma Publishing, and he teaches a number of different courses of all kinds throughout the community and in our international centers, and also to groups in many parts of the world, and has worked with TSK over the years. So, okay, now it's your turn.
First of all, is this okay? First of all, Jack, I would like to thank you for helping Rinpoche expressing his vision, his ideas. You have been involved in all the books and in all the other books. So that's a very large job, and I want to thank you for all of us, our community, our organization, but also people from around the world It must be very difficult for Rinpoche to express in another language something that is so new and original. And he has you, so I would like to thank you very much.
Thank you, and I want to express appreciation really for everybody who has explored this vision in any way. Just the importance of having it as a living vision. You know, publishing the books is one thing, but for people to practice and bring it alive, that's what really counts.
All right, so nobody has to be disappointed in my questions because there is ample opportunity for you to ask your question to Jack. I have been involved with TSK a little from the beginning, more or less. But I would like to ask also some personal questions. And I think in American slang, this is called a fastball down the middle. How did you get involved with TSK?
Right. Okay, so Rinpoche started working on TSK, I think about 1975, and there were some programs and seminars and things that he led, and he was working with Steve Tainer, whom we ought to give a lot of credit to. He's not here today, but he was the editor for the first TSK book. And I remember at one point in 1977, which is when the first book was really coming out, was being prepared for publication, Steve said to me, he said, you know, we have this book, and I'd heard some rumors. We have this manuscript we've been working on. Would you be interested in reading it? And I said, sure, I'd love to. And so he went and he asked Rinpoche about having me read it, and Rinpoche said, no, you shouldn't read it. So I guess that was a false start. And then in December of 1977, exactly 40 years ago, Rinpoche held a book signing party when the book was actually published. And at that time, I went up and spoke with him, and I always get embarrassed when I tell this story because I said something really silly when you're talking to the author of a book. I said, should I read this book? And he said, yes, read it 3 times. And that took me a while. I don't remember. I was actually trying to remember today. I certainly didn't just take to it. I didn't. Some people pick up the book and they say, this is it, this is wonderful. And it wasn't like that for me. It wasn't until we started the first intensive 9-month TSK program. But I participated in that. That was in 78, 79. And I continued. By the time we finished that book, that program, I think I'd read the book once. I'm not sure, but I continued with it, and then later, after I started working full time in the community, then I started working with Rinpoche.
Yeah, I would like to ask a question about that. But first, is it true that the original manuscript was in Tibetan?
Not that I've ever heard. I never heard that at all. That the original manuscript was in Tibetan. I don't think so.
No.
Yeah. The original manuscript, I've been told, was over 1,000 pages long. Mm-hmm. So it was culled down, but no, it was not in Tibetan.
I don't think I want to go much further than one more time, one specific question about this. Do you remember when it got to you? Like what happened? Right.
So what I remember is going on retreats. So in that first program, 1978-79, there were 3 week-long retreats, and then I think it must have been after that there was another retreat that was led by Larry Simmons, who has passed away. He was another person who had a real role to play in the development of TSK. And those retreats, some of them were at Odeon. They were, I think they were all at Odeon. Well, people practiced in different places. But in any event, those retreats were what really got me started. Like there were moments during those retreats when I thought, no, it's not that I thought. There were some very powerful experiences on those retreats. And
so was it the exercises that did it to you?
I'm sure there were powerful exercises, but the moments that I remember were more being outside and just starting to think about things a certain way, and just suddenly the world looked different. You know, things had a different kind of meaning to them, a different order.
And this is a general question that many people do ask. There's quite a few of TSK books. Could you describe a little bit the evolution of the books?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can try. So the first book, which I actually didn't have anything to do with, I already told you the story of how I didn't have anything to do with the first book. So a lot of people say, well, that's TSK, and everything else is, well, I don't know. The real TSK, they say, is the first book. I can't tell you too much about how that book came to be written. As I said, I don't know much about it. So in 1983, I believe it was, I started working with Rinpoche on a manuscript that eventually became Love of Knowledge. And the way that I always thought about Love of Knowledge, and it's not as though Rinpoche has ever laid out a description. You know, he hasn't said, well, now we're going to come at it from this perspective, or nothing like that. So these are just my thoughts. Love of Knowledge seemed to me to be kind of a prequel, a way of working with the more standard kinds of Western knowledge, and in many places a kind of more, you could say, rational, logical inquiry. I think it goes beyond that, but there's a lot of that in it. And I will tell you one story that's maybe related to that question. At one point in the early 1980s, when I'd started working at Padma with Rinpoche, and we were doing the Kanjar and Tanjar at that point, and so I was working on other kinds of editorial work. But that's when he started giving me material for Love of Knowledge. But even before that, at one point, I remember I went to Rinpoche, and I had trouble with that first book. And I said something like, you know, these are wonderful teachings, but sometimes I feel like the books are just, they make it a little difficult to get into the material. And I wonder if it would be possible to present it in some other way that was more accessible. You know, people say that.
Job.
And well, he didn't say any, no, actually he did say something at the time. So this was like my third, it was like 3 strikes and you're out, right? He said, well, why don't you try rewriting a chapter? And I never did. It was all talk and no action. So then when we started working on Love of Knowledge, at one point when I was struggling with some of the material he was giving, he said, so you still think it's easy to write TSK? And so, you know, that was my initiation into that. So the Love of Knowledge book took a long time. Really, we started in 1983. It wasn't published till 1987. We went through many, many, many drafts. And so it had the quality that I was just trying to describe. And actually, while I was working on Love of Knowledge, he gave me a lot of material. And there was a lot of it that I just didn't understand. And I said to him, I can't understand, I don't understand what you're saying here, Rinpoche. And finally, which is not to say that I understood everything that did show up in Love of Knowledge. But so he said, well, just put it aside. So I did. So Love of Knowledge was published, and there's a little in-joke in Love of Knowledge. At the end of it, he says, someone could write a book as big as this one and a second book just as big, and they might still not have gotten to whatever, you know, to a real insight into knowledge. And that was because we already had a second book, you know, a manuscript for a second book there, except that I didn't understand any of it. And so then after that, a while later, he started giving me more material. And he said, put this together with the material that you already had. And it was starting to make more sense to me with the new material. And that became Knowledge of Time and Space. So that was published in 1990. And so I think of that as, well, it is. It's little essays. You know, there's over 100 chapters in Knowledge of Time and Space. And then dynamics came along after that, and that was, as far as I was concerned, that was like a new beginning. It was just a whole different approach. So usually I say to people, you know, some people really love the first TSK book. You could start there, or you could try starting with dynamics. That's how I think about it. And then Visions of Knowledge. Well, actually, dynamics was another example where he gave me the material, I don't know, in 1991 or 1992, and I wrote it up, and it was all set for publication. And at a certain point, Rinpoche said, no, you don't get it. This isn't good enough. And he just put it aside. And then he came back to it in 1993, and he, I think, must have given me more material. I don't remember exactly. And he said, do you think you can do this? And I said, I don't know what I said. But I worked hard, and in the end, I felt okay about it. I felt fine. I mean, I'm very happy with the way dynamics turned out. And, you know, my role in this is just to be, I don't know, he's got to work through someone when he works in English. And so every book takes on a little bit the flavor of the person who's working with it. So it's a very important role, but at the same time, we're just trying to be kind of the megaphone, you know,
the fingers.
Yeah, the fingers, right. Well, the fingers, absolutely, yeah. And then at about the same time that we were getting that book ready, we had started we were publishing some books in the Perspectives series. There'd already been books published in 1980 in the Perspectives on TSK series. But we were doing a new series, and I think, if I remember correctly, there was a little bit of email exchange going on. Email was pretty new at that point, and it was exciting. And I shared with Rinpoche some of the comments people were making in an email group of some kind. And he said, well, I want to make some comments too. And that became Visions of Knowledge.
Mm.
And then in 1997, that was very interesting. He brought together, so I had worked with him on all of those books. And in 1997, he said, well, I want to do something more with TSK. But he brought in 3 people. It was me and Leslie and Lee Nickel, whom some of you know. And he had us all up there at Odeon, and he started giving us all notes on what became Sacred Dimensions. I remember at one point, Rinpoche likes to move around when he you know, he will present things in different places. And I remember him sitting on the steps outside the library in the rim structure at Odeon, for those of you who know it. And the 3 of us were down below, and he was giving us all notes on this, and then we all would collect our notes and come together, and it was really a remarkable process. And that whole book, from the time that he started giving us notes to the time it was published, took 1 month. And we worked together really well. It was great. So that was Sacred Dimensions, and there's a lot of material in Sacred Dimensions that to this day I don't understand. Maybe more so than in the other books, but there are little mysteries in all of the books. I mean, things that I think remain to be explored. Maybe a time will come when people understand them. But there's enough there for everybody. I can't remember who it was now, but somebody just recently said, oh, maybe it's on one of these videos that you'll be seeing. They said, you know, I don't think of these as books to understand. They're just teachings, and there's something to that. Okay, so that's how they fit together.
You have tried to introduce this also at university level. Were you asked, and is it difficult to put it in a certain kind of discipline, these teachings?
Yes, it is. I have tried that, and one of the reasons that I started the Center for Creative Inquiry was with the idea of making a connection to Western disciplines. And actually the way that started was in the middle 1990s, I heard, or I saw, actually I received a flyer in the mail about how they were starting a new journal called the Journal of Consciousness Studies. And some of the people who were participating were people, a couple of them, people I knew. I didn't have many academic contacts, but a couple of people that I knew. It was an academic journal. And I just kind of filed that away. But then later they started doing a consciousness, a conference every year, or every other year in Tucson called Toward a Science of Consciousness. And in 1998, I decided to go to that. And so I did.
Is that for psychologists?
It was for scientists. I remember the subtitle, which bothered me a little bit. It was called Toward a Science of Consciousness, Controversies in the Sciences and Humanities. And I thought, controversy, I mean, yeah, that's how academics like to think. But they were opening it to science and the humanities. So, yeah, psychologists and philosophers. And it was really a pretty broad, wide field. It's still held. That program is still held. I stopped going to those. I went to about 4 of those, and then I stopped. But when I was at the first one I went to in 1998, I looked at these issues, past issues of the Journal of Consciousness Studies. And I remember specifically, there was an article by one of them, by a well-known philosopher. I didn't know at the time how well-known he was, but he is quite well-known. And he wrote an article in there called Consciousness in Space. And that was pretty exciting for me, actually. I thought, gee, if people are willing to look at that kind of question, maybe there's a dialogue that could be started here. What he actually said in that article was that he said, we'll never understand space. It's just a mystery to us. And we'll never understand consciousness either. And that's why he wrote an article about consciousness and space. They're both the same. He's part of a school that's now called the New Mysterians. He was kind of the founder of the New Mysterians. But anyway, that made me think that consciousness studies would be a possible area. Mm-hmm. So I did try that for a number of years. I tried working with people in the field of consciousness studies, and I was going to this conference. And maybe someone more skilled than I am could have found a way to integrate it more, but it's actually pretty difficult because academics have their discipline. And if you have something that speaks directly to what they're working on, then they want to talk to you. But otherwise, most of them are not so interested. So we held some small conferences at Ratnaling. Actually, for 6 years in a row, we did a conference that was all people in consciousness studies. And then the other area that I really tried to work in, and this was through Ron Purser, who's also a longtime student of TSK. He's a professor of management at San Francisco State. And he was very interested in applying TSK in management. And I worked with him on that. And we held a few conferences on that theme. And there the theme was more time, because it makes sense. So we were writing about what we call dynamic time, I think. So those two fields I've tried with. In the end, I came to the conclusion I wasn't getting anywhere. So maybe the time will come.
That leads me to the next question. Is it true to say that some people are more drawn to the space teachings and other more to the time teachings and other more to the knowledge teachings? Or do you think, quote unquote, you should be to all three?
No, actually Rinpoche speaks to that issue. I can't remember where right now. But he does say that some people are drawn to one or the other. And I think it's fine. And I guess the question is, if you study space, for instance, will that become a gateway into time and knowledge and so on? And I think the answer is it can be. But I also think you could spend a good lifetime studying just space or studying just knowledge or studying just time. Obviously there are connections, but no, it makes sense to me that people approach it in those different ways.
And is it true that some people are just more oriented towards space and others are more oriented to time?
Yeah, I think so. I definitely think so.
And if you think so, are you thinking that the space person should study time to be more whole or that this time
Uh-huh.
person should study more space to be more complete? Or what's your position about that?
Well, I don't know if I have a position, but I understand the question. I think that if you say, I want to study space, and that's all I'm interested in is space. I've never really had anybody say that, but if you imagine somebody saying that, I think I'd say, that's fine. You can just go ahead and study space, but go back and look at the other material from time to time, and maybe you will start to find that it speaks to you in a different way. So that's been my experience. You know, I'm more of a space person, but over time, I have gradually, well, I've always appreciated the time sections, but I'd say it's more that I'm working with that more now.
But let's say you have a group. Let's say this group is here for the first time for time, space, and knowledge. And is it correct? This is not the main question, but that some people are more oriented towards space, some more to time and knowledge. And if that is the case, how do you address a group that might be so diverse?
That's a good question. I haven't really had to face that issue for a while, or let me just say, maybe I should just say I haven't tried to face that issue for a while. If I'm doing a retreat, I'd say, okay, here's what we're doing in this retreat. You know,
Take it or leave it.
Right, take it or leave it. I do remember, and I don't remember the details, but Hal and I led a 10-month intensive program in, well, it was in Love of Knowledge because that had just been recently published. But it was a residential program, and people were practicing for hours every day for 10 months. And I'm kind of thinking, but I don't really remember, that we would discuss these people and say, well, this person seems to respond more to the space part, let's work with that. And it was always with the idea that eventually we'd try to broaden out to include the whole vision, yeah.
Could you tell that when you talk to a person, what their orientation might be?
Not right away, not like in 10 minutes or half an hour. I think I would rely more on how they respond to the teaching and the exercises.
Well, this is the only time that I will make a reference to it, but I was in the first, I don't know if it was the first, in one of the early TSK 9-month program. And of course I was new, and there was a group of us that fell asleep with the space exercises. And it was 3 months. We started with space, and we basically fell asleep in every exercise, which makes sense. I can explain that now. But when time came around the corner after Christmas, we were all very alive and vivid.
Right.
And so how to get people through the first 3 months?
Right. Well, so I guess the way that I've led retreats for a while, there's always a little bit of everything. So if there were a 9-month program and people were really intensively doing space, yeah, you'd have to work with people. I don't know. You stayed with it.
Well, yeah, well, we shouldn't reverse the interview, but yeah, it's an important question. It's an important question because the people are the background is of such variety, and the motivation for them being here is sometimes difficult to gauge. They might even have a motivation that they don't know themselves.
Right.
But that brings me to the next question. I've read, certainly in many brochures announcing TSK, and we do this with all our other programs too, it kind of emphasizes the transformative power. And then I'm wondering, does that show up?
I think it does show up for people. Yeah, I do. I don't know if it shows up for everybody. Well, I can say for sure that it doesn't show up for everybody. Like as with any other teaching, right? I mean, you could be receiving teachings from the Buddha, and you might say, "Oh, thank you very much," and you leave,
Well, is it too personal to ask you?
No, I was getting there. So my feeling is, yeah. So I would say for me it has been transformative, and that's a cumulative thing, and it actually has a little bit of momentum. My feeling is that I I find the changes kind of building on themselves. And I think I'm really a very different person from who I was when I started with these teachings. Now, two things to say about that. One is that I've been doing a lot of other teachings too, so it's always a little hard to say.
Age.
Well, and there's age, right, for better or worse. So that's one thing. And the other thing is I don't want to be in a position where people come away and they say, well, he's saying it takes 40 years to have serious impact, you know. I don't think that's true. I think some people respond really almost immediately, and there are a lot of other teachers, I mean, people who've taught TSK and you in this room who might have something to say about that. And then there are a lot of people, one of the things you often hear people say who really are involved with TSK and who've stayed with it for a long time, they'll say, yes, it really is transformative, but it's very hard to say how. It's really hard to say what's changed.
Of course, of course. So it could show up in your, let's say, reflective times, your meditations, or in your more personal life,
Mm-hmm.
or in your work life.
Yeah.
It could show up in any of these.
That's right. But you know, so in the last 5 years or so, I've really become more and more convinced of the importance of the subtitle of the first book. You know, it's called Time, Space, and Knowledge: A New Vision of Reality. Mm-hmm. And so more and more I emphasize this idea that what we're trying to do is activate a new vision of reality. Mm-hmm. And if that happens, then it shows up in various ways in every part of your life. It's like you're living a different life.
Maybe this is not appropriate to ask, but is it true that when you have a retreat, let's say a week-long retreat, which in the old days was nothing, we had 9-month retreats, but nowadays a week is a long time. Is there something common with all the retreatants when they leave? Are they more introvert? Are they more reflective? Are they more open or more intimate? Or is there something in common with all of them?
Right. Well, so when you do a retreat, you've had this experience more than I have. You've taught a lot more retreats than I have. But it seems to me that when you do a retreat, something happens in common. You know, the people who are in that retreat share something, and it's a kind of a group inquiry, a group process of growth. And so everybody leaves having shared in that. And so I think in a way you could say everybody takes away the group experience and takes away a little bit of everybody else who's been there. Mm-hmm. But I don't know that, well, I don't know. I think it really depends. You know, you raised some possibilities. Is it that people are more reflective, or I don't remember the other examples, because when you said reflective, I caught on that and I thought, well, I don't think that's really what happens. Mm-hmm. But now that I think about it, I think for some people that is what happens. Mm-hmm. So it'll be different for different people. So I guess it's a non-answer. Mm-hmm. And
you also write somewhere that Time, Space, and Knowledge is really about inquiry. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to make fun, but I thought it was about time, space, and knowledge. But I say that for a purpose. Mm-hmm. If it's true, it is true, obviously, that it is about inquiry. Is it true that the knowingness that you might discover in space is different than you would, through inquiry, discover in time or in knowledge itself? Or do they all come to the same kind of source of knowingness?
I think they all come to the same source. The answer I'm giving now is a little bit theoretical. I mean, I'm not talking so much from my experience, but Rinpoche does talk, and especially in the first book, about time, space, and knowledge as different facets of being. And I think that's right. I think that the knowingness that you would investigate through inquiry it'll be different. If you start from space, it'll unfold differently. Or from time, but it leads to something that, you know, if someone is a big fan of space and someone is a big fan of time, if they get together and talk, they'll recognize each other, you know, they'll recognize that there's something in common there. And I want to say one thing about inquiry and time, space, and knowledge, because it's interesting, and I just wanted to share this because I was surprised. So I've been teaching something called full presence mindfulness,
We'll
which
get there.
is based on time, space, and knowledge. So at a certain point, I did a search in the TSK books because we have them all on CD, and I should acknowledge Steve Randall, who's sitting over there, as the person who's most responsible for getting all the books digitized and available as a PDF. So I did a search for the word mindfulness because my feeling was that it actually hadn't showed up very much in the TSK books. And in fact, it only shows up once. And he mentions mindfulness and he defines it when he shows it up. And he says, mindfulness is appreciation for time and space. Is knowledge, you could say. The appreciation part is the knowledge. Right?
What about knowingness, if that's what it is eventually all about? Is that correct to say?
Well, yeah, you could use a lot of different words. And I think knowingness is a word that we've ended up using quite a bit because Rinpoche uses it. He also talks about knowledgeability. People have a little bit of a problem with the word knowledge because I would say because it sounds so ordinary. And I remember when we translated the TSK books into German, they were very puzzled by how to translate knowledge because there are two words in German for knowledge, Erkenntnis and Wissen. And one of them is kind of an ordinary knowledge, and one of them is a little more elevated. And they wanted to know which one should we use. And my sense, I could be wrong, and I think they may have changed the way they do it now, but my sense was you should use the ordinary one. You should use the word knowledge because you want to show the connection between ordinary knowledge, the stuff that we just, I know there's a carpet on the floor, whatever it is, between that knowledge and the kind of great knowledge that Rinpoche is talking about. But people have a hard time making that transition. So the word knowingness is nice because it's a made-up word, and it does open up the possibilities in the TSK vision, I'd say. Whether it's exactly what that's about, I'm not sure. I remember somebody having a discussion with someone once about, is TSK really about knowledge and time and space, or just ways into knowledge, or are they equally facets of being? You could say it either way, I think.
So, but when you start an inquiry, let's say about space, and of course, it's not fair to ask you to say that in 1 minute or 2 minutes, but if you do an inquiry of space, what are you searching for? Why are you inquiring?
Mm-hmm. So the way that was originally presented in the first TSK book, I'd say, when the question comes up, well, why should I study this, right? And partly people will say, well, it's so abstract, space and time and knowledge. And other people will say, well, I've already got Buddhism, why should I be studying this? So from both directions that question comes up. And the way it gets answered, or talked about at least in the first book, is that we have this sense of being closed in, of everything being crowded. And so we want to open up space. And with time, we have a sense of being pressured by time. And we want to be able to relax into time in a different way. And with knowledge, there's a sense of limitation, that our knowledge is limited. So I think that's one good answer, I guess you could say, to that question. Yeah, maybe I'll just leave it there. I'd have to start talking for a while to really, I have a little bit different way of thinking about that now, but let's not go there.
Maybe I used the word not correctly, but isn't the last chapter of the first book about complete human being?
Yeah, that's the.
Is that the goal?
I think it's fair to say that that's the goal. Yeah.
So can you say that in your programs? This is what we're on the path to discover our
the
completeness as
fullness of human being, sure.
That's-
You could definitely say that. I mean, I tend to talk nowadays about being fully present to our own being, but it comes to the same thing, I would say. It's a yeah, it's a pathway into what we are and who we are, and it you know, the last time we published books in the Perspective series on TSK, we published 2 volumes at once, and the titles that I gave them were a new way of being and a new kind of knowledge, and it seems to me that those 2 things are completely the same, really.
Well, before we go to the full presence, some small questions. What would you recommend? How to start for a person? Would you also say read it 3 times and call me later?
Well, it didn't work for me, so how can I say that? I mean, I didn't.
What would you suggest now? Let's say
Right.
somebody's watching this. I don't know. We are live stream all over the world. And there's somebody in Kazakhstan who says, "Oh, I found a Russian translation somewhere."
Right,
How do I start?
right.
Of course, you have to start reading, obviously.
Yeah. Well, so that was why we published Inside Knowledge a couple of years ago. That contains selections from the books, and it's meant to serve as an introduction for people. So that's one answer to that question. It's a question that's concerned me a lot because, you know, the experience that we have, I think everybody who's taught TSK, is that people they have a hard time getting started with it. And the readings are difficult for a lot of people. So Inside Knowledge is one approach to that. And it does then lead, as far as my answer to that question, I've really been trying to develop an approach that is more accessible, and I'm trying to kind of connect it up to mindfulness. That's the full presence mindfulness part.
Yeah, I'm sorry to bring this up, but this is also a small question. But the critique sometimes comes up that it is so intellectual. What is your response to that? Not a response here on the interview, but what's your response to that in your retreats?
Well, the kind of down-to-earth, simple response to that is, let's practice, right? I think that if you practice, you recognize that it's not intellectual. But then the question becomes, you know, why is there so much kind of philosophical writing in TSK? Why are there ideas that seem abstract and dense? And I think the answer to that is that we all have our own philosophy. You know, we all already have an understanding of the world or a vision of reality, and the purpose of language, it seems to me, is to point out possibilities. You know, to point the way. And
do you do that through questions, or do you do that through, I don't know, convincing or psychological means, or?
Well, different people are going to do it differently. Different teachers are going to do it differently, and people who study are going to do it differently. I don't like the word convincing. I don't think TSK is about convincing people of anything.
I mean, convinced to be interested in space, or convince them to.
Yeah, how do you convince people that this is worth investigating, I guess you could say.
Well, they're here, so they paid and they have to take time out, so.
Right. So, well, that works in your favor, right? Because they don't want to be disappointed, so they're willing to give you a little bit of time to convince them that this is worthwhile, right?
But then it's so difficult to talk about your experiences because they're not in the mental realm, so.
Yeah, well, I think one of the really the beauties of TSK, of the vision, is that it does open up the realm of experience in unexpected ways. We think we know what counts as experience, but there are these new possibilities that open up, and that happens through the exercises. but then, and again, it'll be a little different for different people, but I think it's really remarkable, the Rinpoche's use of language in the TSK books is so evocative. So evocative is a wonderful word because literally it means calling out, right? It calls out possibilities. Mm-hmm. And I think the language, it is an exercise to read the TSK books. Mm-hmm. So it does happen. It happens. I just had an email from someone in the online course I'm teaching now. They said, well, it was someone who doesn't speak English as a native language. They said, can you post these readings in advance? We're doing very short readings now, very short, because they're so dense. They're so difficult to work with. And before somebody starts to read, I think they do have to be convinced in a way that this will be worthwhile. Mm-hmm. So when I'm picking out things for people to look at, I try to pick out things where the beauty of the language, where somehow I can help show the beauty of the language, and then they say, yeah, it's like why would you read poetry? Mm-hmm. I'm not saying TSK, some TSK is very poetic, but why would you read poetry? Well, because it leaves you a different person, and mm-hmm. I think the language can do that, but you have to be willing to go along.
We'll come to full presence soon, but
we should probably not go too long, much longer.
One scary question, for me it is, because Dharma Publishing exists 40 years as well, so Rinpoche asked, how can you make sure it will exist another 40 years? Mm-hmm. Looking back, 40 years went fast, but if you look ahead, 40 years is a long time. Mm-hmm. What can we do to preserve the practice, the study of TSK for the next 40 years? Right,
well, so you keep saying, I'm going to get to full presence mindfulness, but you already have gotten to full presence mindfulness. That's my answer to that question.
Really?
Yeah. My feeling is that, I have not been satisfied with the way that TSK has made its way in the world. There are people whose lives it has really affected and had an influence on in a very profound way. But it's a very small group of people. And I don't think that there's a critical mass that would allow it to continue into the future. So my feeling is we have to find new ways of presenting it.
And your way is?
So the way that I've been trying to work with is full presence mindfulness. And that's based partly on the fact that if you say mindfulness now, you automatically have a kind of a ready audience. You have some people who are interested in mindfulness, and partly on the fact that I think that the way mindfulness is being taught, although it does really good things for a lot of people, and there are very sincere practitioners of mindfulness, both in the more traditional Vipassana sense and in the modern mindfulness movement. Very, very sincere people who really get a lot of benefit out of it. But I think it could go a lot deeper. And so I see the possibility for bringing a kind of the TSK vision into dialogue with mindfulness.
Is in those three words, is there TSK in those three?
In full presence mindfulness?
Yeah. Does one represent time and one represent...
Right. I've never actually thought of it that way, but you could say that if you wanted to say that, and of course, that's fun up to a point. Sure, full has to do with space, and presence has to do with time, and mindfulness has to do with knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Before I go to my last question, is there anything else you'd like to tell us about full present mindfulness, what you're doing at the moment? You have an online program, you do give retreats.
So what I have in mind with full presence mindfulness is to really create a program that is a lot like mindfulness programs, the way that they're taught now, which means you've got a certain structure. You've got an 8-week program and a 1-day retreat, and you start with the breath. So I basically do all those things in full presence mindfulness, and I don't know yet if it's going to work. We're really in the first year of doing this program. So there's that side of it. And what I would like is to train people to do that teaching. I think that, and to develop a program that, that you can really separate out and say, I think that's one of the reasons full presence, or rather mindfulness in the usual sense, has been successful, is that you can say, here, come take this training, come use this manual, and you need to have some experience, you need to have a kind of appreciation, but you can use these materials and you can teach it. And I think that that's essential. I think there need to be people out there who are teaching it so that it's not, it's not just, Jack understands something about TSK, let's enroll in a class with Jack. It can't be like that. It has to be something that's not personal. It has to go out, the teachings have to speak for themselves. And that's really what I'm trying to do with full presence mindfulness.
Well, they certainly will look to you for an example.
Sure, and that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
But I do want there to be a manual that, says in class 1 do this, in class 2 do this.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do that, and if you follow this approach, it will be beneficial.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we can have one more small question, and we can open to the public if they have questions. This was just for me very interesting, but maybe not to you. On the very last page of the First Time Space and Knowledge book, there is a feather and a globe.
Right.
Did that mean anything to you?
Not so much initially. I never liked the drawing very much. That's probably what I learned from it, or one of the many places where I've seen that what you like and dislike is not the basis for anything.
And not for inquiry, for sure.
Yeah. But I'm just being honest about that. So no, I kind of left that alone for a long time. I would say at this point, it's meaningful to me, but I would never, it's just me personally. For other people, that may be the golden key that opens everything, that image, For me, if I could say something about it, but I'd never use that as the heart of it. Does it speak to you?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
But I make up stories. I don't know if they are any relevance or not. So, I make up the story that Padmasambhava used a feather to distribute the teachings to his 25 disciples.
I see. Okay, well, yeah.
Sounds good to me. I don't know if it's true.
What is it? When a single feather in 1,000 worlds has... One of you guys must know it by heart, right? Who can say which contains which, or which is... Who can say... Okay.
Riches. Something about riches.
Riches? Well, you've got the book in your hand. You could, but
I have one more question.
Okay. Let's finish. Let's let Arnaud ask his last
there's
question.
one more question. I don't know if you apply this method, but would you suggest, and do you do this yourself, do you learn sentences by heart?
Not deliberately. There are certain sentences that I've learned by heart. You can hear that I've learned the first 5 words of this one and no more. Mm-hmm. But there are certain sentences. There is one sentence that I've always loved because it seems to me so important, and it's on the knowledge side. And the funny thing is that I've never been able to find it in the TSK books. I'm convinced that it's there, and we have the PDF, and it's very simple. It's just knowledge is not what the knower knows. I love that, but where is it? A little secret teaching, right? Somebody took a feather and distributed it to me.
I have not taught TSK much, but whenever I studied it myself or with other people, the sentence, everything is knowable, struck the most.
Okay.
Could you understand that sentence?
Everything is knowable? Yeah, I would be more inclined to say everything is knowledge, but it's not really separate. Everything is knowable. Yeah, there is... Well, so I'm kind of circling around, but there is nothing that is not knowledge. And so, yes, everything is knowable. And that's just so, to me, that's so straightforward. there is nothing that is not knowledge. I mean, here we are, and everything that appears to us appears because it's knowledge that's available to us. It's not something esoteric.
All right. Are there questions from the public? I don't know if we have time. Jack is the master of ceremonies.
I'm the master of ceremonies. We have time. Sure. We're flexible. Ken? Oh, we have microphones. That's right. We're going to have, thank you, Michael. We're going to give people microphones for the sake of our live stream audience and our archive.
And I'm uncorded.
Yes.
I just came up with my favorite sentence, a summary from Dynamics, and it's something like, why can't I think now? Rinpoche is saying in Dynamics, I used to think about time, space, and knowledge much as everybody does.
Right.
Now I think differently. And I think that always strikes me as core. That
Right.
it's so wonderful.
Right. Yeah, the simple ones are the ones that count. The longest sentence from TSK or from any of the books, I think, that I remember, and I'm going to give it, but it would need some unpacking, but I'm going to tell it to you because I do love it. And actually now I forget the first few words. Let's see. In one integrated movement, that's not quite right, that's close enough. In one integrated movement, the self takes a position, posits a situation, and imposes meaning. And
You knew that too, that sentence? Anybody else would like to?
Right, any other
question?
favorite sentences?
Anybody else has a favorite sentence from any of the books? Oh, maybe you don't like that exercise, that's okay too.
Be okay to ask a question? I think one of the real hindrances in TSK is a very limited understanding of space that we have. I mean, how in the world to get past the notion of space as emptiness? And emptiness meaning like vacancy, nothing going on. Seems to be a real challenge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll back up for just a moment and then I'll really answer your question, but or try. I told you that I read this paper by a philosopher called Consciousness in Space. And so my intention was to write something for this Journal of Consciousness Studies about consciousness in space. And I wrote one article that was about something else that was published in the journal. And then I wrote one about consciousness in space. And when I'd finished the article, I looked at it and I thought, in order to get to the part that I think people could connect with, I've got to introduce, or I'm introducing such a strange notion of space, such a different understanding, that I'm going to lose my audience. No one's going to care. And so I never submitted the article. So yes, our usual understanding of space is really limited, and of course that's why Rinpoche, wants to open it up. I think the way that I try to work with it, but I don't know that this works for everybody. Well, of course it doesn't. Everybody has their own way, but I like to point people toward mental space. It's not so hard to get people to think about the fact that
rental space?
as though we could rent a room in space.
Mental space.
Yeah, mental.
Mental space.
Right, or lentil space, if we... No, mental space. It's not so hard to get people to accept the idea that thoughts take place, or especially thoughts, take place in a kind of space of their own. And that begins to open up the idea of space. Of course, they'll say, well, that's just a metaphor. we know what space is. Space is this empty thing that's totally meaningless and nobody cares about it, right? Um, so that's why I try to do something with mental space, because once you have mental space, you can say, well, look, what's the difference between the space within which the thought occurs and the thought itself? They're both mental space, right? They're wearing different clothes. But, so that's how I try to do it. But I've noticed that it's more natural or more common for some people when they're teaching to really approach it in a kind of more direct way, where they say, well, look at the space that, at the edge of an object, for instance. And when you begin to do that, it opens up.
Well,
Yeah.
well, I should know my place more, just asking questions. But after 40 years of time, space, and knowledge, like the space between you and hell is definitely not empty. Wouldn't you agree?
I would agree.
Absolutely
The
not.
difference between separation and intimacy is one of the themes where those of you in the online course know we're exploring that theme right now. Yeah, and yeah, in a way, it doesn't seem like it should be that hard, and that's a great example. It's like, don't you understand something about intimacy? I mean, I don't mean to say that. First of all, I'm not addressing you. I have some imaginary person who's in the room, and I say, don't you have some experience of intimacy? And doesn't the sense of space that comes with intimacy look very different from the kind of empty space that you imagine exists between you and something that you don't care about?
Anyway, is it the next person's turn? Or?
Yeah, shall we stop now? I think maybe that's good. So maybe stretch for a moment, but we're going to have Hal and Ken come up here. Hal, as I said before, was one of in that first TSK retreat, the 9-month retreat, Hal was one of the main teachers. And Ken's certainly been studying this as long as I have, maybe longer, I don't know.
From that first meeting.
Yeah.
I would like to, I made a boo-boo. Of course I should have brought this latest book along because I'm Dharma Publishing. So I didn't. My excuses. If you wish it, I'm happy to send it to you free. I mean, the book not free, but the shipping free. So if you want the book, let it be known, and either I can bring it to the Institute and you can pick it up, or however you like. So let me know if you want this book. This is the latest, and Jack has put all these articles together and gave orientations to each one.
Okay, so we'll have a minute where we're changing seats. Thanks, Arno.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was fun. Give Ken and Hal a chance to make their way to the front of the room. A couple of people are going out to use the bathroom, so I assume.
Jack, the feather line comes from the end of the epigraph.
Oh, it's not about the last page?
Right at the end.
When I do the ground, it's kind of music.
Sure.
There's no button. When I do the ground, I kind of music.
Sure. And casting that word out.
Maybe okay. Let's get started.
I want to, hi. So great to hear Arno and Jack do dialogue. And that has inquiry in it always, right? And so there's responsiveness, and that gets something moving, and there you got time. That's what you need. And it occurs in this wonderful space. And that we respond to it with a smile or a frown doesn't really matter. There's a knowing going on there, right? Really, and that knowing derives from a wonderful intimacy that's carried on as a vision, which is a kick and a half. It really is, in old-time language. Hal Gurish is here. I don't know if everybody knows Hal. I assume most everybody does. Hal carried the banner, TSK, kind of into the world in the after that original book signing party that Rinpoche presented his vision. He did a couple of things, added many things. One was to say the evocation of knowledge, mantra, if you will, chant, something like that, Shasamaha. Did that 3 times. And then said, and from now on, you just kind of keep that within yourself. That's a good thing. And one way for Shasamaha to get into me was to my primary TSK teacher, Hal Gurish. Hal taught the first programs at the Institute, TSK programs. And the thing that struck me most about what you said, almost the first day, was, hey guys, this is a complete teaching. And for a person who is used to thinking of there is going to be years and states and various handshakes learned maybe, or initiations, who knows how to talk about that, I don't especially. That was so refreshing. This was an open and available teaching by an extraordinary man, Tarteng Toku. And now, here I am learning it with Hal Gurish. Hal, thanks a lot for all these years. And round of applause, please, for Mr. Gurish. So, my friend, TSK for you now, or
wow. Well, I'm not reading TSK anymore because my eyesight is poor. And I can read with great difficulty, so I choose more to practice. And so now my practice is really the most important part of TSK to me. When I read the manuscript, I think that was, back in 75, was it? Yeah. It was TSK that was the most, I'm sorry. It was time that was the most evocative for me. And it wasn't so much the text, the readings, as it was the exercises. And I would say that that was my I'm at a loss for the word, but it was really that the main way I got into TSK was through practice.
I remember Sylvia Gretchen saying exactly the same thing. I said, Sylvia, what do you think about this? And she said, I'm not doing that much thinking, but I really practice a lot. I really do. So it's a great thing. I thought we could do some practice here, very briefly maybe, space practice. So we'll try to time it up somehow. At least we can measure it. We use time for that, don't we? And I was thinking of the sequence of the source of thoughts, space between thoughts, and thoughts as space. It's a lovely sequence because you begin kind of, well, here I am with a thought. And the question is, well, where did it come from? And typically you say, oh, I read it yesterday in the Times. There was an editorial, or I saw an advertisement on a bus going by and gave me the thought, it's a sale. No, I mean, no, really like in point of experience. Let's go that way. Well, what in the world do you mean that? Well, just look into your thinking and ask yourself, where was it before you started thinking? A little room, maybe? Take an elevator? How did it get up? How did it show up? Can't I refer it to something that just happened and that thought there and bring it on? No, that's boring. That's a railroad track. Who would want to do that? So let's take like about maybe 4 or 5 minutes, go into that inside world, and ask inquiry, right? Which is the heart of TSK. Observably, where did that thought come from? What's the action? And where does it go? Just simply that, for a little bit of time. Okay. I'm always struck by TSK, how much we can learn almost immediately, and how there's sort of a movement to want to explore more. I find that absolutely staggering. I come up with a thought. Where did that thought come from? And it runs right off to another thought. And all of a sudden, I've got a line of thoughts and I'm telling a story, just down the line. I say, wait a minute, that's not what I was hoping people would do. So, so what do you do then? You reorient. For me, at least, I kind of reorient myself. And there's sort of like a stillness occurs. Not much of a stillness, but a little bit. And the thought becomes more of a unique arising. In a curious way, more of a thing than a referring. And that's striking. As the song says, it blows my mind, quite literally. Okay, let's take this as basic practice, you can say, one step more. Here's a thought. Here's another thought. Another thought. Tell you what, here's a thought, thought A. As thought B is coming up, usually to replace in some way thought A, see if there isn't a little bit of a space between those two. And in a very kind of casually focused way, go right there into that space. Like take a breath and leap, if you will, but casually. Let's try that for a couple of minutes. Okay. Could you find a little place of entry? Just kind of, It's easier to indicate with hands, actually, than words. Just, here's a place, here's a thought. There's something in that place, isn't there? You could explore right there. If you're like me, I'll try to make it like every place I've ever known. I'll try to find walls, try to find a place to have a story. But it's there. And it's not, I don't know your experience. Mine is, it's hard to say it's got stuff in it. It's hard to say it's empty in the sense of vacant. In some ways, it's wildly full. Third step. Let's go back to a thought. As if we were looking at it, the text reads, for the very first time, there you are, your sense of self, your presence, your kind of space arising, or time arising, whatever you want to say. There you are, and here's a thought. You're looking at it like almost for the first time. And right at that point, you and that thought, explore the thought. Do inquiry. Any way you can come up with inquiry. Anyway, all possibilities. And to give us a boost, we'll do the evocation of knowledge just very briefly. The letters are sha, samaha. And maybe we can do that 3 times together. Sha, samaha. Sha, samaha. Sha, samaha. Okay. There's lots of magic around. Absolutely extraordinary. Did any ice cream show up? I thought that bell was calling for. Truck was coming around the corner. Here's a good... And that's okay too, right? I mean, just because there's a thought doesn't mean it's going to remain itself. Much more protean than that. Much more protean. Well, that's a little bit TSK taste. And health, thank you so much for your work over these years.
So we only have one more part of the program. We're trying to be done. We should be done a little bit before 6. Adjourn downstairs. And that is playing some videos. Thank you. So the final part of the program is to play some very, very short videos. We just asked people if they would like to record on their iPhones or whatever device they could figure out how to use, which was a challenge for a couple of them. A short video that just says something about their connection, to TSK. So we'll play them. And then afterwards, we're going to open it up if any of you would like to say anything, questions, certainly. But also, it's been a long time probably since we've had so many people gathered in one room who really have sustained experience in exploring the TSK vision. And I want to give us a chance to benefit from that. So right now we'll have the strangers from far realms. And I thought I'd say just a little bit about each person. This is Yolaine, as we start, just a very little bit. Yolaine, when Hal and I taught that 10-month intensive program, Yolaine was one of the participants. That would have been back in 89, 90 maybe, something like that. And she mentions that. So Yolaine, I was just about to say that. Yolaine is from the Netherlands and has taught, she studied TSK there, and in addition to coming here, and she's taught it herself. Okay.
So TSK, I started to think about why I started with TSK. But thinking about it, I realized that it was much more interesting to realize why I stayed with TSK. I just started in 1982, and before that I just had read the whole TSK book, cover to cover, but I skipped each and every practice that was described in there. I thought they were a little funny. So I was more interested in reading what Rinpoche had written there. Very interested. I read the whole book. But then when I had finished the book, I thought, I can read forever, but I must do the practices. And that's what I did. And I went to a retreat in Berkeley, a 1-year TSK, no, it was Love of Knowledge, 1-year Love of Knowledge retreat. And that was wonderful. And then I found out that studying TSK and Love of Knowledge, that was the thing that I wanted to do. That was what I wanted to do. No science, no research, just that. And I stayed in the community, and that took until maybe 25 or 30 years, and I became a member of the community. And that was the most interesting. I stayed with TSK, and still I have the love of knowledge. The love of knowledge. Shifted from love of knowledge to love of knowledge. And that's nice to stop in that sense, or to go on in that sense.
So the next video is Michael Gray. Michael lives in New Mexico. He's been here at various times at the Institute. He's studied a lot of things. Most of the people here have exposure to the Nyingma teachings, other than TSK. Not everybody. So, Michael.
I can still remember encountering the first time-space knowledge book in the middle 80s and how it opened up everything for me. And these days, I still read a few pages most mornings from one of the TSK books or another. And for instance, recently I read in the book Knowledge of Time and Space this phrase: not knowing might carry a knowledge that can encompass both knowing and not knowing. And I realized that's the persistent message in all these books, TSK books, that there's another possibility in respect to time, space, and knowledge than the kind of the presence and absent dichotomy that we live in most of the time. So like in respect to knowledge, we either know something or we don't know something. And in respect to time, we live in a present moment and everything else is absent. The past is gone and the future is not yet here. And in respect to space, we're only interested in substantial objects or objects we think of as substantial, and everything else is empty, uninteresting. Meanwhile, the TSK vision presents this knowledge as the inherent characteristic of the world we live in, and time is this dynamic reality, and space is accommodating and open, and it's a wonderful message. It opens life.
Okay, so the next person you see here is David Philippone. David has had no other connection with the Nyingma community. He came to TSK and he stayed with TSK. He's from around Philadelphia.
Hi, my name is David Philippone, and I was recently asked to briefly explain what has been the impact of TSK on my life. I'm retired, no longer a professional, and my 34-year career as a manager is a contextualization of countless remembrances. TSK did not figure in the first 20 years of my career, but the last 10 years or so it did. During the first 20 years, I was struggling to make a mark, get ahead, make money, gain recognition, acquire things. It was a rather self-centered perspective. The feeling of spiritual starvation was growing until it was no longer an unformulated urge, but a palpable realization that something was missing, and whatever it was, I was not addressing it. I've been reading and practicing TSK for about 20 years. Looking back, it's had a profound and positive effect over time. I came from a life filled largely with myopic concerns to now slowing it down to more fully participate in the depth that experience makes available. That's the key thing. Opening more of my life moments to a depth of perception that is more encompassing. Not just more things, but the space for capacity for appreciation. Opening an aperture that unfolds with less fear, anxiety, and more gratefulness, affection, and creativity. That is truly what changed the trajectory of my life. I feel the way I imagine a flower might feel as it blooms. Thank you.
So next we're going to hear from Karin Tomak. Karin is lives in Germany.
This is Karen Tomak from Germany. I want to send my greetings to you all who come together tomorrow for this day, TSK anniversary, and I want to thank Rinpoche and his students who were presenting this vision the last 40 years and giving us so much guide. And I'm very glad that there are students coming together and supporting each other. For me, in the beginning it was not easy to get more engaged, and it took some time, and I was asking myself, what will happen? Is there a change in my life? And gradually there was a shifting. It was a kind of wondering how reality arises. Well, how every situation is built up, how thoughts come up, how the future is arising in every moment, and there was an increasing sense of more possibilities in each moment, of more chances we have to choose, and situations lost very often their stuckness and were loosening up. This was also working for my
students, she wanted to say. She apologized for cutting it off at the end there. So now we're going to hear from Carolyn Pasternak, whom most of you know. She lives up at Odeon. I think Carolyn and I actually met on a TSK retreat back in the late 70s.
"40 years ago, I bought Time, Space, and Knowledge, and like most people I know, I tried to read it, and it was completely unintelligible to me. 2 years later, I took the first 9-month TSK program, and then it opened up. And the experience of that program really has been one of the most memorable ones in my life. The teachings just affected me profoundly at that time. I continued practicing TSK after that program for about a year or two, and then I got involved in a lot of work and projects in our community and set aside TSK for many decades. Then last January, when I was studying Dimensions of Mind, all of a sudden the thought came to me one day, I think I want to go back to TSK. And I picked up the first book again, which in my opinion has always been the best and always been the most compelling to me. And I started reading it from the beginning, and the experience of reading it again was like boom, just everything dropping in a slot and being transported over decades into time now in a whole different way and in a whole different way of understanding the TSK vision. And that made complete sense to me, because what is so special about TSK is its ability to really allow you to touch time and space and knowing in completely different ways than the ordinary. So I have re-engaged with TSK. I have fallen in love with it again, and I actually feel like I want to start teaching it because it's just so special. And I really do feel, I've always felt, and I feel even more now than ever, that the time, space, knowledge, and teachings are the single best teachings for Westerners to really allow us to touch freedom.
Okay, so now we have Klaus Noldus. No, that's not Klaus. There we go. who lives at the German Center and runs that store that you see behind him.
TSK has enriched and maybe even saved my life in many ways. Since years I read the books again and again, just a few pages a day. This is my main practice, and I always feel ease and joy after reading just a bit. I'm far from understanding each sentence, but it seems to me these books are not written to be understood, but to open everything that is limited and fixed. To me, TSK is not so complicated than traditional approaches. It doesn't call for a path to follow, no complicated teachings, ceremonies, vows, visualizations, or similar. Just appreciation of the basic dimensions of our lives, time, space, and knowledge, is enough to liberate our modern minds and find joy of being, peace, and freedom. Thank you so much, Tartang Tulku Rinpoche, for this immeasurable treasure. And happy birthday, TSK. May TSK flourish for times to come.
Okay, so that's all the videos we have of individuals, but after we had all those, the Dutch Center sent us this. And then after we did that, I had a little exchange with the person who sent that, and I said that was the grand finale, and she said, well, what about the fireworks? Stop there. Right, there's 10 hours of it, and we could condense it with some TSK exercises, but we'll just let it go. We'll stop it there. So maybe, I think I'm going to sit down because these mics work a little better. So maybe people would, anybody here? Anybody like to say anything? Anything that was inspired by what you've heard with the practices we did? Those really heartfelt messages? Anything at all? Yeah, Ramon.
Question regarding the experience of a thought popping up, appearing. In my case, maybe it calls for a deeper state of meditation to be able to see the space where, in between two thoughts. That demand is almost like a movie. In a movie, suddenly there is another image. And in my own experience, it's like a fading. It feels more like if you watch a so big, large soap bubble, there will be like little shapes forming, iridescent shapes that change, become something else. Becomes red, and then it becomes blue, but it is not, I cannot find the distinction in between these changes. When I acknowledge a change, it's already changed.
Right.
Now, the feeling I have here is like, is the context of it is our emotions, deep emotions that somewhat operate, pop into a vacuum. It's like a need, like it's where a need for a thought to pop up, and it comes out of this. And it has to do with more like deeper emotions. I cannot, at the level of thought, can find the separation, which brings my question to myself. Are we all thinking the same way? When we're talking about thought, it's mine, her mind, do they have the same mechanism exactly? Or perhaps it's different and we cannot directly say, okay, here's where thought starts, I'll stop here. Well, that's my question.
So now I'm going to quote one of my memorized sentences, I guess, from Knowledge of Time and Space. Rinpoche says, to say I know is to say I stop here. So I don't know. That's my answer to your question. I do think, from my experience over the years, that people's minds work very differently, and people's experiences are very different. And if you look for the space between thoughts, and what you find is iridescent thought bubbles, that sounds good to me, you know. Keep looking. Don't say, well, now I know what the answer is. You know, go back to the exercise, work with it. But there's no sense of right or wrong in this, really. And what you describe is, you know, I think illuminating. I imagine that's illuminating for me to hear that. So.
Thank you, Morgan. So I can just respond. I use the practice of space between thoughts regularly, and I've discovered that many people think visually. In other words, images are the primary flow. Many people think in words. Many people think in both simultaneously. And some people, and all of them are able to count their thoughts. But some people, like you, cannot count their thoughts. There is no defined juncture between the two. And sometimes it's because it's like waves, breaking or moving. So anyway, when I do the practice of asking people how they think, I'm always very careful, or count your thoughts, I'm always very careful to say, well, don't worry if you can't count your thoughts. Some people can't count their thoughts. It's just as Jack said, we think in different ways.
Oh, good. So not knowing it work. Okay, I hope I didn't deafen anybody with my laugh. Anybody else who's had experience? I should have acknowledged Bar as somebody who's one of the early TSK teachers also. So. John?
I think I just want to pay homage to TSK. TSK on record here, and just express the deep gratitude I have for it and for Rinpoche for creating for this expression, this doorway. And I resonated a lot with the last two speakers who spoke of the freedom that it represents, because that's very much my experience in the way that it, both through the language and through the practices, undermines all the structures that we take for granted and that limit us, and it just allows that to continue to unfold. And the more it unfolds, the more it opens, the more beauty and freedom is visible, is experienced. And So I see it's just a deeply moving vision for me, and I've been working with it since '92, mostly on my own for about 20 years, except for one retreat, and then in the last 5 years, more in interaction with Nyingma and Jack. And I think when we work together in groups, like you alluded to, it amplifies our ability to open to it. So I think there's a lot of power, and I'm going to make a shameless plug for full presence mindfulness, because I've always felt too that, there needs to be a kind of gradual experiential unfolding of TSK, because it can easily bog down, I think, and when you're just reading it alone. And so I really appreciate the approach you're taking, because I think it's based on some fundamental experience, and you can keep building it and keep building that. And then the intellectual part, the mind part, that becomes easier to work with. So yeah, just grateful to be here, grateful to exist.
Thanks. So, anybody else? I think we're actually at a very good point. It's called 6 o'clock, and so we can stop there. I want to mention a couple of practical things. First of all, in terms of some programs that are going to be going on that you may well not know about. So first of all, this is being live streamed, so you should let people know who you think might like to view it. It's going to be available at the live stream site, right? Or through our Facebook site. And the link is on the Facebook page, the Center for Creative Inquiry Facebook page. Then, going chronologically, one of our long-term students who studied TSK originally with Larry Simmons is a fellow that most of you don't know because he's usually down in Arizona, named Hayward Fox. Hayward is a psychotherapist, and he's been for a number of years now been teaching workshops that are based on TSK, although he doesn't really talk about the book so much. And he's going to do a one-time short hour-and-a-half workshop online in February that we're sponsoring through Center for Creative Inquiry. It's on, he's calling it What TSK Has to Offer to the Psychology of Our Time. So let people know or find out about yourself. There's some charge, it's not too much. And then starting in March, you heard Carolyn say in her little video that she wanted to start teaching TSK, and that was not just an idle threat. She's actually going to start teaching online, and the money that she generates from that will go to support Odeon. So that's a nice opportunity to engage the TSK teachings. It's always valuable to connect with different teachers, to hear from different teachers and see how they approach it. So if you're interested in that, if you know how to contact Carolyn, fine. If you don't, contact us, and we'll put you in touch with her. And she will let people know what the specifics are. She did say she's going to work with the first book. She's going to do a lot of practice. Going to work through the book, starting from the beginning. Lots of practice. Then there is going to be a full presence mindfulness retreat. There's going to be one in April in Germany, and there's going to be one in May on the North Coast, not at Ratnaling, at a place further north than that. And those are really intended for people who have gone through the full presence mindfulness program, but there's a possibility for people to participate if they already have a pretty good connection to TSK. So if you think you might like to do that, let me know. So that's what's happening in the spring. And then in the fall, there'll be another full presence mindfulness course starting. This is the 8-week course. I guess I should say we have these various websites. Fullpresence.org is about the Full Presence Mindfulness Program. Creativeinquiry.org is a very out-of-date website. Try to overlook that if you choose to look at it. It's better really to go to the Creative Inquiry Facebook page, which is maintained, and David Philippone, whom you saw here, has done a whole lot to keep that page active. He's constantly posting beautiful images in connection with quotations from the TSK books. And so that's a very live presence. So we're very grateful to him for doing that. And there is a site, also really out of date, called tskvision.org. You'd think that would be the basic one, right? But we just haven't maintained it very well, but we will. Okay. Arnaud, thanks for the offer of making books available, shipping them at no cost to people who are interested. And again, I'll mention that some of you may not have seen this book, Inside Knowledge, which is intended as an introduction, a kind of a sampling of some of the themes that come up in the TSK books. So that's it. Thanks everybody for being here. Morgan? Yeah, I was about to say that. There are snacks downstairs, including some warm food, including spanakopita, but in the meantime, some nibbles. So, we'll see you down there. Thank you. Should we get